Hello, I'm Jim Garrison. I'm the president of Ubiquity University. I'm also a professor in world history. And I'm coming to you today about the situation in Ukraine, which is getting sufficiently dangerous, not only for the Ukrainians and the Russians, but Western Europe, and in fact, everyone, given the fact that we are now seemingly on a momentum towards some kind of nuclear exchange and confrontation between the United States and Russia. I say this because on December 2nd, the chairman of the Lithuanian Chief of Staff announced that the United States forces in Lithuania, which is part of NATO, had changed their modality from defensive to offensive and were ready for immediate action. This is the first time that U.S. forces have been on the Russian border. It's coming within a conflagration that is spreading throughout Eastern Europe and, in fact, destabilizing the entire world order. So I think it is very important for all of us to understand that what is happening now in Ukraine is the most dangerous moment that the world has been in, maybe ever in my lifetime, but certainly since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And it's worth just recalling what happened at that time. In 1961, the United States launched an invasion into Cuba called the Bay of Pigs. It did not work. Castro, who was the leader of Cuba at that time, looking for how he could defend Cuba from another attack, which seemed to be in the offing, appealed to the Soviet Union and to the General Secretary there, Nikita Khrushchev, to deploy nuclear missiles in Cuba, like the United States had deployed nuclear missiles in Turkey, right at the Soviet border. In the months of 1962, starting in May, June, when the United States became aware of that, and the missiles were on Soviet ships sailing toward Cuba, there began a momentum in the U.S. corridors of power. How should we deal with the fact that an independent country within international law is inviting Soviet missiles on its soil, 90 miles off the Florida coast? The United States invoked the Monroe Doctrine, enunciated by President Monroe in 1823, that basically asserted that the United States would not tolerate any country from anywhere deploying military weapons or military forces anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, from Canada down to Argentina. That was the Monroe Doctrine. Further discussions happened, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and most in the cabinet recommended to President Kennedy that he go to nuclear war. Kennedy couldn't conceive of doing that. And working with Adlai Stevenson, who was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and with his brother Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, they began negotiations, secret negotiations with Khrushchev that led to the Soviets withdrawing their missiles from Cuba and the United States withdrawing its missiles from Turkey. And in fact, Kennedy was so unnerved by that experience that he reached out to Khrushchev subsequently and began a momentum toward the first nuclear treaty, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which initially stopped nuclear testing above ground, continued it underground, and led to a series of US-Soviet summits and US-Soviet nuclear treaties that began the process of lowering the temperature and reducing the number of warheads, because each one of the nations had enough nuclear capacity to destroy the world dozens and dozens of times over and end any kind of civilization that we know of. It's exactly 60 years later, from 1962 to 2022, that we have our situation in Ukraine. So what I'd like to do is just spend some time explaining what happened in Ukraine and what is at stake for the world in coming to an immediate ceasefire and another summit where Russia, the United States, and Ukraine can work out their differences in a diplomatic and peaceful way. Because unless we do, the momentum toward escalating the war and the increasing probability of a nuclear exchange is too terrifying for us just to sleepwalk through history. So consider this a teach-in. You know, back in the 1960s, when I came of age, we had the Vietnam War. And like now, in those days, we were told that Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam, was an evil man and you couldn't negotiate with him. And he was like Hitler, and they were going to invade South Vietnam. And if that happened, there was going to be the domino effect, and the communists were going to take over all of Southeast Asia, move on to India. And the United States had to stop communism in South Vietnam. As we look back on it, we of course know that none of that was true. But at that time, like today, around Ukraine, 80% of the American public believed what the government was saying, believed that that was the situation, and supported US troops going into South Vietnam, at the conclusion of which 50,000 young men were killed, millions of Vietnamese killed, wounded, and displaced. And nothing was forthcoming other than a humiliation to the United States as it was forced to withdraw under President Nixon in 1973. We started with teach-ins just to explain what was happening, what was the truth of the matter. And that's what gradually woke the public up. And combined with a consciousness raising and massive protests on the streets, we finally got the political leaders to withdraw from Vietnam. 8 years later, from 1965, when they had manufactured the Gulf of Tonkin incident, orchestrated by the United States, then blamed on the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, that legitimated the United States sending in troops. I bring this to everyone's attention because something very similar has been happening to Ukraine, and it's my purpose to share with you what's happened. Before we do that, I just want to express in the deepest way that I can sympathy for what's happening in Ukraine right now. Millions of people have been displaced. Nearly 120,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. 20 to 25,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed. War is hell. And whether it's in Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan or Syria, wherever war breaks out, countries are destroyed. People are wounded, killed. displaced in vast numbers. So before going to war, we ought to all contemplate seriously what our strategic objectives are, why we're doing it. And that's what I'd like to share a little bit today. And I'd like to start with a map, so we all just see what is actually going on. Let's start with the map. You'll see this is Ukraine. Vladimir Putin and the Russian army did not invade Ukraine to take it over. They did not invade Eastern Europe to reestablish the Russian monarchy or the Greater Russia. What they have done is very limited. And to understand what they did and why they did it is essential in understanding where the solution lies. They've taken the eastern part of Ukraine, southern part of Ukraine, down to Crimea. This is the Black Sea. What Russia has done is essentially secure a land bridge so that as a great power, it has access once again to the Black Sea, which leads to the Mediterranean and to the Atlantic. So the question that we have to ask ourselves as we think about why did Russia at this moment, starting in February 2022, why did they do that? Why did Vladimir Putin, for the first time in 75 years since the end of the Second World War, why did he invade eastern and southern Ukraine to secure a land bridge to Crimea and access to the Black Sea? That's the critical question all of us need to contemplate. In order to understand that, we need to go back to 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down. We all remember the Berlin Wall and the fact that it was torn down, and the world rejoiced. What we need to understand is why that happened. And the reason why that happened is because of Mikhail Gorbachev. And I just want to say, as we talk about this, that this is not a matter of academic interest to me. I was very active in Soviet American affairs during the 1980s, particularly when he came in March of 1985, all the way through to 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. I worked at the level of the Central Committee and the Politburo. I was deeply acquainted with Alexander Yakovlev, who was the head of ideology in the Soviet Politburo. And it was Yakovlev who had brought on Edward Shevardnadze and Mikhail Gorbachev and had groomed them so that in 1985, when after Brezhnev, and then there was Andropov and Chernenko, after the old guard had died, Gorbachev was brought in as general secretary, and Edward Shevardnadze was brought in as foreign minister. I knew them both. I knew Yakovlev. I knew Boris Yeltsin, and it was the one who had brought him to the United States in September of 1989, during which he'd had that epiphany and began the machinations that led actually to the overthrow of Gorbachev. I was the last foreigner to be received in the Kremlin by Gorbachev before he resigned. I was literally standing beside Edward Shevardnadze when, after the resignation, he closed the doors of the Soviet foreign ministry as it was being taken over by the Russian Federation. So I know intimately, through my direct experience, what I'm now going to tell you. When Gorbachev came in 1985, what he basically said to President Reagan, Maggie Thatcher, Helmut Kohl in Germany, was that the Cold War is over. We're not enemies anymore. And we should work together toward the goal, as he put it, that the security of one is the security of all. And that was one of the reasons why he got the Nobel Peace Prize, because people recognized that he had a passion for peace and saw that his essential legacy was to bring peace. And he did the best that he could. And his basic proposal, and I'm going to show another map here. His basic proposal was that the Soviet Union withdraw from East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Those were the Warsaw Treaty Organization partners of the Soviet Union. And Gorbachev said, if we're partners, we don't need NATO and we don't need the Warsaw Treaty Organization. And the Soviet Union is willing to withdraw from Eastern Europe, allow Germany, you see Western Germany and Eastern Germany and Western Berlin and Eastern Berlin, allow Germany to be reunited. Now, this was an extraordinary concession by Gorbachev, because you remember during the Second World War, the Germans under Adolf Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, invaded Russia in 1941. And at the end of that carnage, 20 million Russians were dead and tens of millions wounded, displaced. And so as the Germans withdrew their forces from the east, the Soviet Union went west and consolidated a buffer zone. And at Yalta in 1945, when Stalin met with Roosevelt and with Churchill, they agreed that the Soviet Union, after what it had endured, had the right to have a buffer zone. By the 1980s, 40 years later, Gorbachev recognized that that was no longer useful. The Eastern European countries were under duress. They didn't want the Soviet yoke. The Cold War was essentially dysfunctional. So the agreement was by Gorbachev that, and President Bush by that time, and Thatcher and the Germans, was that the NATO alliance would not move an inch to the east. That was the exact words they agreed on. It wouldn't move an inch to the east if the Soviets withdrew. Now, let me just show you the next map. By 2015, this is what happened. The United States did not keep its word. After the Soviet Union broke up in 1991, and the United States experienced what it called the unipolar moment. The Soviet Union was no more. It had already withdrawn from Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Treaty Organization was falling apart. Germany was in the process of reuniting. The neoconservatives in the US, Dick Cheney, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, and particularly George Bush Jr. when he became president, said now is the moment to really defeat Russia. So rather than accepting Gorbachev's proposal of a common security zone, the neoconservatives in the United States began the momentum toward the expansion of NATO to the east. And it was under President Clinton that first Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic came into NATO. And then under Bush Jr., you see Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, Croatia also came in. And then in 2008, in May of 2008, in a conference in Bucharest in Romania, the United States said, we're now going to take Ukraine. Now, there is where Ukraine is. And I want to share my screen again with another map, because it's really important that you understand what we're doing here. So you see where Ukraine is in relationship to NATO. That's 1,200-kilometer border with Russia. Here's Moscow. So by NATO moving into Ukraine, it was moving literally into the heartland of Russia with an aggressive military, nuclearized force. And it was in that year, in the aftermath of the Bucharest conference, that Putin said, this is a red line. This is an existential threat. Ukraine needs to be neutral. And if NATO tries to NATOize the Ukraine, we will respond to secure our strategic interest. And he said at that time in 2008, we'll retake Crimea, because that is Russia. So the next point that we need to take in, why was Ukraine a red line? In addition to the obvious reality that it juts into the heartland of Russia. For the Russians, Ukraine is the origin of Mother Russia. Let me show you one more map, just so we can see what we're talking about here. In the 9th century, about 1,300 years ago, what is now Russia began in what they call Kievan Rus. Here's Kiev. This is Ukraine. Well, this was the origin point of the kingdom of Rus that over time migrated to the east and to the north until it became modern-day Russia. But it has always had dealings with Ukraine. And as you see here, even at the beginning, but particularly since 1783 under Catherine the Great, Russia has had Crimea and a land bridge and access to the Black Sea that goes into the Mediterranean that allows Russia access to the Atlantic. So when one talks about a red line, what one is talking about from a Russian point of view is the historical reality that Russia began in Ukraine. The Crimea, all that area was originally Russia. But given the vicissitudes of history and circumstance and rising empires, you know, there was many conquerors that took it away and exchanged. Then there was the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians never had a separate country really until 1991. And the Ukraine, as we know it, was really a construct of Vladimir Lenin and the construction of the Soviet Union. And in fact, in 1954, Nikita Khrushchev gave Crimea to Ukraine, even though Russia was guaranteed access, because he was trying to straighten out the borders, because at that time, the Soviet Union was at its height. and no one thought it would collapse. So there's been an ease with which Russia and Ukraine have interacted, and historically. So when we think about Russia and Ukraine, we need to just take in that Russia has as much right to that part of the world as, say, the Jews have to Israel. They have an ancestral home in Israel, in Palestine. And after the Second World War, after 2,000 years of absence, they went back to their homeland. Well, the homeland of Russia is Kievan Rus. It is Ukraine. And so when the United States and NATO announced that they were going to also now militarize Ukraine into an American-dominated nuclear weaponized force right on the Russian border, Vladimir Putin said no. The United States basically blew him off and continued to destabilize Ukraine. And as you all know, in 2014, 2015, the CIA and the Americans engineered a coup. This was under President Obama, orchestrated by then Vice President Joe Biden, to overthrow a pro-Russian, pro-neutral leader for someone who was anti-Russian and pro-West, pro-NATO. And as soon as the coup was over, the Ukrainian parliament voted to abolish the Russian language, to prescribe Russian culture in school, and began to bombard the Donbass, where in the eastern Ukraine, which is 80% Russian speaking in culture, and began to destabilize the situation as the United States and NATO began to arm Ukraine, send in contractors and military operatives to assist in the training of the Ukrainian army, because the intent was to take over the Donbass and possibly retrieve Crimea, which Putin had taken in the aftermath of the coup in 2015. He had gone in and seized Crimea, taking back Crimea, and declared that Crimea, as it was historically, was Russia. In 2022, the Russians invaded and secured their land bridge to the to the Black Sea. And Putin has further said that Russia will use nuclear weapons to protect what is now Russia, because it's been annexed into Russia. So what you really have, and this is why there's such a danger, you have the irresistible force of American and NATO militarism meeting the immovable object of Russian nationalism. And that is why the world is in such a dangerous moment. And the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation is being sacrificed because the United States abrogated the basic agreement with Gorbachev in the 1980s, as a result of which the Soviets withdrew from Eastern Europe, allowed Germany to be reunited. And it's worth remembering that not only did Gorbachev, but Yeltsin and Putin all echoed the Gorbachev line that we're not at war anymore. Russia is capitalist. That was the coup that Yeltsin transacted. He destroyed communism. So why is NATO expanding to the east? We should be partners, they said. Both Yeltsin and Putin all suggested that Russia join NATO, join the EU. But instead, the United States insisted on marching to the east. And that is bringing us to the Cuban Missile Crisis level of nuclear danger, because the Russians are not going to back down. Everyone should understand that. The Russians are not going to back down. And they're willing, as you can see in the news every day, to pound Ukraine into, the Middle Ages until the United States and NATO stop the NATOization of Ukraine. And that brings me to the next point that I would like to make. We need to understand that what is at the heart of the Ukrainian situation is U.S. aggressiveness, like it was in Vietnam, like it was in Iraq, like it was in Afghanistan. But in Ukraine, the United States is making the most strategic blunder in its history. And Ukraine will go down as the moment when the United States ceased to be worthy of the accolade world leader. And I want to unpack this because this is really important for all of us to understand. The United States, in moving NATO to the east and now trying to take over Ukraine and pose an existential threat to Russia, which it seeks to dismember, transacting regime change. That's what's next, is making the same mistake that Napoleon made in 1812 when Napoleon invaded Russia, the same mistake that Hitler made when the Germans invaded Russia in 1949. Well, between 2015 and now 2022, the United States is trying to invade Russia, trying to destroy Russia. And it will fail, just like Napoleon and just like Hitler. And to understand the magnitude of the colossal misjudgment of the United States in this matter, just think for a moment if the United States had said yes to Gorbachev. We would have today a common economic and security zone from Gibraltar to Vladivostok that would likely be liberal democracies. Gorbachev talked about democratic socialism. That was at the heart of his policies of glasnost and perestroika. Yeltsin was begging Washington to help Russia liberalize, and we wouldn't do it. And I would refer here to Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs is the economist, as you know, from Harvard and Columbia, who was retained as a advisor to Boris Yeltsin. He advised the Polish government, and he was very active in Eastern Europe and also in Russia around the end of the Cold War, in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, and in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And he got everything that he wanted and recommended, because he was suggesting the obvious, that this was the moment when Eastern Europe and Russia should be brought into the international multilateral institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the GATT, the WTO, and be supported in the transition to a liberal democracy. That was what could have been done. Gorbachev asked President Bush Sr. for aid, and Bush refused. Jeffrey Sachs recommended to Washington, after the success in Eastern Europe, that we begin the same policies toward Russia, now under Boris Yeltsin, and Washington refused. So we are in our situation right now with Ukraine, with the possibility of nuclear exchange, because the United States, not Russia, chose to be militaristically aggressive. And that just needs to be understood by everyone. Until finally, in February of this year, Putin, seeing no other alternative, had to secure what Russia has historically possessed, and that is that land bridge from Russia to Crimea into the Black Sea. What makes this even more dangerous is the fact that, unlike in previous occasions, back in 1989, for example, or the Vietnam War, the world was relatively stable. Now we have runaway climate change. We're in code red. We are experiencing ecological turbulence and chaos at an unprecedented level, where everywhere around the world, extreme weather events are shattering infrastructure. If there's been ever a moment when the world needs to come together, it's now. And rather than coming together, the world is being rent asunder right at that moment. And we need to understand that right at there's a simultaneity, because right at the moment when the climate is spinning out of control, we're heading into a nuclear exchange in Central Europe with one of the greatest powers in the world. That's the recipe for suicide. So this is one reason why I'm coming to you with this video. We have to understand the gravity of what is going on. And I believe, as I said, that the United States with Ukraine has so egregiously violated both international agreements, but also geostrategic realities, that what we're now going to see is not the demise of Russia. We're going to see the demise of the United States. And I'd like to make this as a final point, because it's essential for people in the United States and people in Western Europe, which are the only places in the world that support what's going on in Ukraine. The rest of the world does not. The rest of the world understands, just by looking at a map, that what the Russians have done is basically stand up against the American military machine, and have been supporting Russia, abstaining in the UN votes. So what we need to do is to wake the Americans up and the Western Europeans to what's now going to happen. You'll remember the sanctions. The sanctions were supposed to inflict a heavy penalty on Russia. That hasn't happened. The penalty has been experienced in Western Europe, that was completely dependent on Russian energy and gas. So there's been inflation. There's been all kinds of economic duress in Western Europe and in the United States. Russia has been basically unaffected by the sanctions. But what it has been doing, it's been consolidating an alliance with China, with India, with Iran, with Saudi Arabia, with the Emirates, with Brazil, and with other countries to attack the US dollar. And it's doing that in the following way. You'll remember back in 1972, President Richard Nixon took the United States off the gold standard. Simultaneously, he and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, worked out a deal with the Saudi king that they would protect Saudi Arabia, even against Israel, if the Saudis would guarantee that all the oil sold would be denominated only in US dollars. So the US went from the gold standard to the oil standard. And since that time, 1972 to 2022, 50 years, one of the reasons why the United States has been so strong is not only because of the military capacity that the United States has with 800 bases around the world, killer satellites up in space, and all the military hardware, but also because of the primacy of the US dollar. That is now going away. Last month, Saudi Arabia announced, in agreement with Russia and China and India and other countries, that no longer will oil be sold in US dollars exclusively. Other currencies now are going to be used to transact oil, which is the most bought and sold commodity in the world. And this is why I say that Ukraine will be remembered, not as a time when Vladimir Putin and the Russians, in an unprovoked way, invaded Ukraine and took something that wasn't theirs. It's going to be remembered as that moment when the demise of the United States began. Because if you erode the US dollar, the US economy begins to collapse, and it'll be no longer capable of supporting the vast military machine that it currently deploys around the world. And it will have taken place because of the most colossal, egregious misjudgment in US history. Had the United States agreed with Gorbachev, Yeltsin, Putin, and absorbed Russia, US supremacy would have been ensured in the foreseeable future, because you would have had one US-dominated system from the Western Hemisphere, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, all the way to the Pacific. That isn't going to happen. Instead, the world is now organizing against the United States. And what we're going to see in the future is the collapse of Pax Americana as the neoconservatives tried to build it through military force, beginning with the end of the Cold War. That unipolar moment is over. So what should be done? We need an immediate ceasefire. We need an immediate summit between the Russians and the Americans and the Ukrainians. And again, if you just look at the map, you have the solution. Russia keeps what it's taken, which is rightfully Russia's. Ukraine has the rest, which is about 80% of Ukraine, including access to the Black Sea. So both countries have access to the Black Sea, and Ukraine is neutral. NATO can keep the rest. But Ukraine, because of its strategic and historic significance to Russia, needs to be neutral. And by the way, this is essentially what Henry Kissinger said. I'm not just coming to you with some subjectivity here. Major people like Henry Kissinger, like most of the ambassadors, U.S. ambassadors that have been in the Soviet Union and now Russia, they all warned against this. The Secretary of Defense, William Perry, at the time when Bill Clinton took the advice of the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, to start expanding NATO, he not only objected, but he considered seriously resignation. So what I've been saying is not just Jim Garrison giving a point of view, but is the point of view of many thoughtful people that are well worth all of you searching out and listening to. Henry Kissinger called it in Davos earlier this year. He said Ukraine is not worth the deconstruction of the international order. It just isn't. Russia should keep what it's taken, and we need to build the next generation of cooperative structures. We have climate change to deal with. We have major ecological and global issues that need humanity's full attention. We cannot, he said, sacrifice everything for a country that is not even in the strategic interests of the United States. And I believe the world understands that. And what we need urgently in the United States and in Western Europe is a peace movement. It's tragically ironic that in every other war of my lifetime, from Vietnam to Iraq, we had a massive peace movement. But there's been almost no peace movement around Ukraine as we sleepwalk into possible nuclear exchange. We need a peace movement. We need a ceasefire. We need a summit to arrange the new order. And the United States finally needs to repent of its militarism. And I would suggest apologize to the world for what it has done since 1989, when we could have worked with the Russians to secure peace. But instead, we militarized NATO till finally the Russians were forced to take a defensive measure to secure their historic access to Crimea and the Black Sea. And as a result, a coalition is rising, intent on destroying the U.S. primacy. These are hard issues to talk about. I understand that they're challenging to probably many of you listening. But as far as I know, as someone deeply immersed in these issues, what I've said is about as close to the truth as you're going to hear from anybody. If you're interested in getting involved, be in touch with me at jgarrison1951@gmail.com. I'm spending now my energy, my creative intelligence. How can we generate a peace movement to get the United States to stand down in Ukraine and allow for the possibility of peace? Thank you, everyone. We need peace, or we will self-destruct.